Please be seated.
Messages from Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor.
The Honourable the President of the Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I've received certain messages from Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor, which I now transmit to you.
All right, please.
The Honourable the Lieutenant Governor transmits estimates of certain sums required by the offices of the Legislative Assembly for the service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024, and recommends the same to the Assembly. The Honourable the Lieutenant Governor transmits estimates of certain sums required by the government for the service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024, and recommends the same to the Legislative Assembly. Please be seated. The Honourable the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the 2023-24 offices of the Legislative Assembly estimates and the 23-24 government estimates. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I also wish to table the 23 to 26 Government of Alberta Strategic Plan and the Budget 2023 Ministry Plans.
Government motions. Motion number 21. Honourable Mr. Taves.
The Honourable the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I now wish to table the government's 2023 to 26 fiscal plan and move government motion 21. Be it resolved that the Assembly approve in general the business plans and fiscal policies of the government. Mr. Speaker, I count it a tremendous honor today to rise in the House and present Budget 2023, the fifth I presented on behalf of Albertans. In the fall of 2019, I put forward a four-year plan to bring the province back to fiscal responsibility and a balanced budget. In some respects, these past 4 years have felt like a century, in part due to the extraordinary global challenges we've faced, but also because of how far we've come. When as a government we took office in 2019, Alberta had an economy that was flatlined, and we were spending $10 billion more than comparable provinces on services without better outcomes. Our plan to strengthen Alberta's economic foundation was twofold. First, to bring discipline to Alberta's spending. We could no longer afford to be the spending outlier among Canadian provinces. And then we were determined to position our province for competitiveness, leading to exceptional investment attraction, economic growth, diversification, and job creation, thereby ensuring an increase in fiscal capacity and provincial revenues. These goals were, to put it mildly, ambitious. To achieve them, we committed to three fiscal anchors that informed our decision-making. The first anchor was a commitment to keep Alberta's net debt to GDP ratio below 30%. This would ensure that debt and debt repayment would not strangle our economic growth. Second, it was imperative that we would get our spending in line with comparator provinces. And third, when there was economic clarity, to chart a path to a balanced budget. As we implemented our ambitious economic recovery plan, the impact on Albertans was almost immediate. Our red tape reduction initiative has saved Albertans $2.1 billion. We established the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation with $1 billion of capital so Indigenous communities can be full partners in the Alberta Advantage. Our government invested in strategic infrastructure projects that were essential for future growth while getting Albertans back to work at a time they needed it most. And by July 2020, we had cut Alberta's corporate tax rate from 12% to 8%. We recapitalized the Alberta Enterprise Corporation, adding $175 million to support investment into Alberta startups. And we established Invest Alberta to sell the province's incredible value proposition to the world. And then, on February 23rd, 2022, I was able to stand in this House and present Alberta's first balanced budget in a decade. And that brings us to today. Today is Alberta's leading the nation in economic growth. Today, with a rapidly diversifying economy, there are career opportunities that didn't even exist a few years ago. Today, Albertans pay $20 billion less in taxes than they would if they lived in the next lowest tax province. Today, after some very difficult years, the opportunities for small businesses and entrepreneurs are exploding. And today, I again present a balanced budget. This means debt is on the decline. In this last fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, we paid off over $13 billion of debt, all of the debt that matured in 2022. This means lower debt service costs and more resources available for health, education, and other programs. It means more available fiscal room and thereby more runway and capacity should we experience another economic shock. Mr. Speaker, we are by far and away below our net debt to GDP ratio ceiling of 30%. Today, Alberta's at 10%, the lowest in all of Canada by a long shot. And because of our strong balance sheet, Alberta has received its second credit upgrade of the year, remarkable when we consider that our last credit rating increase was back in 2001. Investment attraction is essential to Alberta's strong economic growth and job numbers. In my business experience, a government will either help or hinder progress, get in the way or get out of the way. It's an attitude, Mr. Speaker, and it matters to investors. 4 years ago, we put out the Open for Business sign, and we followed it up with real actions, Mr. Speaker, not just words. We've reduced business taxes, cut red tape, and have created one of the most business-friendly environments on the continent, and the results speak for themselves. In a year when venture capital investment dropped in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, we in Alberta, at $729 million, set another record. Businesses across sectors and across the province are creating thousands of new jobs while diversifying Alberta's economy. Just days ago, Plexus Technologies announced they were moving their Canadian headquarters to Calgary, creating 125 tech jobs. Southland Trailer Corp in Lethbridge will double its production, creating 250 jobs. De Havilland is moving its head office to Alberta instead of subsidized Quebec, I might add. And it's building an aerospace center and manufacturing plant employing 1,500 people, and that's just the start. CGC Development is building a $210 million wallboard manufacturing plant in Wheatland County. Garmin Canada has announced expansion plans for their Cochrane head office that will double their workforce in 2 years. We have Imperial Oil investing $720 million in the Heartland for a biodiesel refinery. Drilling activity in the oil and gas sector ramped up to an 8-year high last year, and investment is expected to grow by a further 19% in 2023. IBM is opening its Client Innovation Centre for Western Canada in Calgary. SideTrade is investing $24 million to make Calgary its North American headquarters. Air Products is building a net zero hydrogen complex right here in the Heartland. Amazon, Walmart, Canadian Pacific, Dow, Infosys, Emphasis, HBO, Northern Petrochemical, RBC, CN Rail, on and on. This afternoon to our lower cost of living and the abundant opportunities we offer. Like the story of Nick and Jessica, two young professionals, one from Edmonton, one from Vancouver, debating about where they're going to start life together. When Jessica recently visited Edmonton for the first time, she was surprised by its natural beauty, but what tipped the scales? The high wages, the affordability, and the cost of housing. Edmonton is cold, Jessica says, but I can buy a coat. It's not surprising, then, that Alberta is leading the nation in population growth, and more Canadians are moving to Alberta than any other province. Our growing population means good news for Alberta's labour market, opportunities in every sector from finance to film, energy to agriculture mean we need a skilled workforce to keep up with the labour demands in the province. Budget 2022 committed $170 million, intended to create 7,000 training spaces for jobs in high demand. And I want to commend our Minister of Advanced Education for his work in this area. Because, Mr. Speaker, he took funding for 7,000 spaces and worked with our incredible post-secondary institutions to create 10,000. 10,000 additional learning spaces for high-demand occupations and professions across sectors and across this province. Now, while Alberta's economy strengthens, we cannot afford to become complacent. We continue to face headwinds, fueled by supply chain constraints, global unrest, and our federal government's irresponsible fiscal policy. Inflation is making life more costly for all Albertans, at home, in business, and even in government. At the same time, despite record-breaking investment in Alberta, we continue to see declining business investment nationally. Since 2015, Canadian real GDP has grown by 13%, but this growth has been entirely driven by government and consumer spending and residential investment. Much of this growth has been funded by debt, and it's masked the stagnant state of Canadian business investment. Alarmingly, between 2015 and 2019, business investment in Canada actually declined. One of the impediments to business investment in Canada is Canada's growing reputation as a nation where it's difficult, if not impossible, to get large projects completed. Global investors have taken note of the many projects killed by the Trudeau government: Northern Gateway in 2016, Energy East in 2017, the Tech Frontier mine in 2020, and at least 15 LNG projects. In fact, since the Federal Impact Assessment legislation, Bill C-69, was passed in 2018, there's not been one project subject to the Act approved in all of Canada. Not only has Canada lost out on billions of dollars of investment that would have created more jobs, better paying jobs, and greater financial stability for Canadians, we've turned our back on a world that desperately needs what we offer, including responsibly produced energy. If Canada fails to maximize responsibly produced energy production, we're not only failing Canadians, we're contributing to massive hardship for the world's most vulnerable. Canadian energy will help those living on the margins heat their homes. It will make fertilizer more affordable and boost agricultural output. It will improve air quality by displacing dirtier fuels, but it can do none of these things if it's left in the ground. If Canada abdicates production, it simply moves to countries that give no credence to ESG concerns, with despotic leaders who use their energy wealth for destructive purposes. And it leads to increased emissions and pollution as more coal is used in electricity generation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if Canada is serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the best thing we can do is export clean-burning Canadian LNG. An energy-rich democracy like Canada that continues to hamstring its world-class responsible energy production with carbon taxes, emission caps, and a regulatory quagmire at a time of global shortage is irrational and grossly irresponsible. Canada not only has an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, we have a deep responsibility to prove ourselves a reliable trading partner and ally and deliver responsibly produced energy. Mr. Speaker, as we reflect on our journey as a province over the past 4 years, and as we recognize both the significant triumphs and the challenges we're experiencing today, the question becomes, where do we go from here? How do we maintain a strong balance sheet and positive economic trajectory? What can we do today to secure Alberta's future tomorrow? First, Mr. Speaker, I'm appealing to the rest of Canada to follow Alberta's lead to make business competitiveness a key priority. Securing a prosperous future for the next generation depends on it. We need to be a nation that once again can get big visionary projects completed. We need to be a nation that values the welfare of Canadians above the ideologies of the elite. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a saying going around the province: please, Lord, Give us one more oil boom. And I promise not to squander it this time. As I recall, there was a different term, less parliamentary term used for squander. Remaining disciplined and responsible is most difficult during years of plenty. I expect most, if not all of us in the House today would agree that whether in our businesses or households, the tendency to unsustainably increase spending as revenues rise is almost inevitable. In this province, with our economy heavily influenced by commodities and our volatile revenue structure, it's been our story all too often. The second key then, Mr. Speaker, is to maintain responsible fiscal management into the future through a framework, a series of well-calibrated fiscal rules and guardrails. We're introducing legislation that will require a balanced budget. We'll limit year-over-year operating expense growth
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me to go over some highlights of Budget 23, which will also serve as the 22-23 third quarter fiscal update. Budget 23 secures Alberta's future by growing and diversifying the economy, strengthening healthcare and education, improving the safety of communities across the province, and establishing a new fiscal framework. This plan achieves the priorities of Albertans, which include ensuring the government lives within its means. Over the last 4 years, our relentless focus on investment attraction, job creation, and diversification has secured our position as the economic engine of Canada. Alberta's economy has momentum, and Budget 2023 continues that positive fiscal trajectory with another balanced budget and forecasted surplus of $2.4 billion in 23-24 and projected surpluses of $2 billion next year in the mid-year and $1.4 billion in 25-26. Budget 23 also continues our successful Alberta at Work initiative that's helping Albertans build their skills and fill thousands of new jobs as businesses grow and more corporations invest in our province. We're investing even more towards building capacity in our healthcare system to deliver better care for Albertans. We're strengthening our education system so that our children and grandchildren are prepared for their future. We're improving safety and security in our communities while responding to the needs of vulnerable populations. And we're saving for tomorrow and paying down provincial debt so that the services we rely on are secure for decades to come. Job growth in Alberta has been phenomenal this past year, and people from across Canada and around the world continue to move here in record numbers and take advantage of our job opportunities, high wages, low taxes, and affordable living. National and global companies have expanded in Alberta, creating new jobs, diversifying our economy, and taking advantage of our extremely competitive corporate income tax rate. Budget 23 is securing Alberta's advantage. Building on the $600 million committed over 3 years to the Alberta at Work initiative, Budget 23 includes an additional $370 million to get more unemployed Albertans back to work. We critically need more doctors and nurses to provide care for Albertans, so we're creating 1,800 new seats for healthcare aides, licensed practical nurses, and registered nurses. Now we're also committing $30 million over 3 years to create 120 more seats in medical degree programs at the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary, a 40% increase in the total number of seats that will be in place to train future physicians. We're expanding training opportunities in other sectors as well. Another $35 million over 3 years will expand enrollment in non-trade construction programs and training in the energy, technology, business, and aviation sectors. We're strengthening Alberta's economy across all industries and creating opportunities so every family can participate in the Alberta Advantage. While economic growth is strong, times remain tough for many families and households. New relief measures are helping post-secondary students with lower student loan interest rates and more repayment assistance. We're providing more grants and bursaries to low-income Albertans upgrading their skills to fill jobs in high-demand sectors. These measures will keep $178 million more dollars in the pockets of students each year as they upgrade their skills and acquire new knowledge on their road to successful careers. This adds to our comprehensive affordability measures, including the suspension of the fuel tax, electricity rebates, the indexation of personal income taxes and social supports to inflation, and targeted supports to our seniors, families, and most vulnerable. We're also making record investments in kindergarten through grade 12 education to secure the future for our youth. In total, Budget 23 provides an additional $1.8 billion over 3 years, including a 5.2% increase in 23-24 to fund enrollment growth, reduce class size, meet the specialized learning needs of students, and improve transportation. The 23 capital plan supports 58 school projects, including new schools that will provide new and improved student spaces, create jobs, and revitalize Alberta communities. During our budget consultations, we heard from Albertans across the province who identified the need to strengthen our healthcare system and increase its capacity. We've heard you. Budget 23 commits $965 million more this year for healthcare. That's a 4.1% increase to reduce wait times in hospital emergency rooms, provide more surgical capacity, and get more ambulances on the road to respond to emergencies. We're supporting the Alberta Surgical Initiative with $237 million over 3 years, including $120 million in new money to build and expand operating rooms in 14 communities to allow thousands more surgeries across the province. $158 million this year alone will support a plan to increase the number of healthcare professionals in Alberta, especially in rural areas. Another $150 million over 3 years for emergency medical services will hire more staff and improve ambulance response times, and $15 million will put more ambulances on the road. Our healthcare action plan will fundamentally transform and improve healthcare delivery in the province. Public safety and a fair and efficient justice system are key responsibilities of government. Budget 23 commits $1.2 billion in operating funding to public safety and emergency services and $655 million to justice. This represents a 12% increase overall. This funding will increase the number of Crown prosecutors and add support staff to address the backlog, increase capacity, and modernize our courts. It means more boots on the ground to better fight crime in our communities. Budget 23 also provides $22 million over 3 years to strengthen First Nations policing. This will fund a new First Nation police force in Siksika and additional officers in Indigenous communities across the province. Alberta's strong balance sheet wouldn't have been possible without our commitment to responsible fiscal management. We intend to lock in this commitment and secure Alberta's future with a new fiscal framework that requires balanced budgets, controls operating spending, and provides a framework for surplus cash. A balanced budget requirement and limiting spending increases to population growth and inflation will ensure appropriate and sustainable spending. The spending ceiling will challenge government to focus on how we can transform the way we do things to improve the way we deliver services and programs, while making sure Albertans' hard-earned tax dollars are respected and used efficiently. The fiscal framework will ensure the government continues to prioritize saving for the future and the paying down of debt, and balanced budgets will become the norm instead of the exception. While our forecast revenue of $70.7 billion for 23-24 is down from our 22-23 revenue forecast of $76 billion, we're projecting another surplus of $2.4 billion for 23-24 and further surpluses the following 2 years. Record bitumen royalties of $12.6 billion have helped keep our province in the black, but corporate income tax revenue is a big part of that story as well. Just over 4 years ago, Alberta's corporate income tax rate sat at 12%, based on the assumption that a higher corporate tax rate would categorically result in more government revenue. The problem with that thinking is that there are lots of other places corporations can choose to do business, and many of those other places had a more competitive business environment. So companies passed over Alberta and went elsewhere. Investment in Alberta declined during those years, as did corporate revenue. So our government set out to create a business environment that would attract business investment back into Alberta. One of our first steps was the job creation tax cut. Now at 8%, our general corporate tax rate is significantly lower than the next lowest provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and our combined federal provincial corporate tax rate is lower than 44 U.S. jurisdictions. The result is investment across sectors, aviation, technology, and financial services, to name a few, is exploding. And with it, expanded fiscal capacity resulting from higher corporate income tax revenue, resulting in higher corporate income tax revenue. Record high corporate income tax revenue of $6.4 billion this year and $5.9 billion next year, to be exact. That's significant. This is why fiscal responsibility matters, why investment attraction matters, why diversification matters. This is how we fund programs and services that support Albertans. Total expense is forecast at $68.3 billion in 22-23, higher than at budget last year, as we've helped Albertans deal with the rising cost of living, covered agreements with doctors, teachers, and other public sector workers, and increased capacity in the justice system. In 23-24, operating expense is forecast at 3% higher than last year, then grows moderately by 2% for each of the following 2 years. Alberta's oil and gas sector continues to play a vital role in driving our economy and creating prosperity for hardworking families and for our entire nation. The government is forecasting a price of $79 US for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate in 23-24, dropping to $76 and $73.50 in the out years. We continue to stand up for Alberta's energy industry and the Albertans whose livelihoods depend on it. And we continue to invest in projects and programs that reduce emissions and help grow and diversify Alberta's energy sector. Alberta's economy is poised to grow at 2.8% this year, continuing to lead the country. And Canadians are taking notice of our incredible value proposition of low taxes, opportunity, and affordability, and they're moving here at record rates, with Alberta's population expected to grow 2.9% in 23, the fastest pace since 2007. Budget 23 is a budget that secures Alberta's future. We're securing the health and education of Albertans by increasing access to family doctors, surgeries, and emergency services, and making sure our children and grandchildren have the education system they need to reach their full potential. We're securing economic success and prosperity by charging Albertans $20 billion less than they would pay under the tax system of the next lowest province, positioning Alberta for investment attraction, diversification, and job creation. And we're securing our future with a new fiscal framework that will require appropriate and sustainable spending, prioritize debt repayment and savings and surplus management, and ensure the next generation is not encumbered with a debt they did not incur. Budget 23 is securing Alberta's future, your future. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Media Q&A, you'll have one question, one follow-up. Either give us two at the top or one and one. We'll start with those in the rooms before we go to the phone. Just a reminder to introduce yourself, your name, and your outlet. With that, we'll start with the first question here at the mic.
Yep. Graham Thompson. Today I'm with the Toronto Star. Minister, this is a pre-election budget. You may not see it that way, but it certainly is. So how has the upcoming election influenced or affected today's budget?
Well, Graham, you're right. We have an election here in a few months, and this is a budget just ahead of that election. But really, Budget 23 continues the direction, the course that we set in 2019. And that course was twofold. It was about bringing responsible fiscal management back to the province. As you know, we set a fiscal anchor at that time of aligning our per capita spending, per capita cost of delivering government services with that of comparative provinces, and we've delivered on that objective. At the same time, we set a path back in the day, back in 2019, to ensure that Alberta's business environment was most competitive so that we could attract investment, see a growing and diversified economy, which we knew would result in increased job opportunities for Albertans, but also increased revenues for the government as we had expanded fiscal capacity. Budget 23 continues on those two main themes. Now, we're going to add to that because following COVID, it's been clear in this province and every other province in Canada that healthcare is a challenge. And everywhere I traveled in my pre-budget consultations, Albertans were concerned about our healthcare system. That's why we're increasing healthcare funding by 4% this year, almost $1 billion in 1 year alone, to ensure that Minister Copping and all the great folks in our healthcare system have the funds they need to improve, transform the system to deliver better for Albertans, to reduce surgical wait times, to reduce wait times in emergency rooms, to reduce the wait times for our paramedics to get out and assist somebody in an emergency. Now, the other thing, Graham, we did is we supported Albertans at a time of inflation, at a time when affordability is a challenge right across the province. And so, again, we signaled our affordability support in our mid-year report. Of course, this budget funds a number of affordability measures, certainly in the upcoming budget year and even in the future years. But again, that's simply a response to the fact that, you know, in Alberta, over the last 3 years, we did the heavy lifting fiscally. We got our fiscal house in order. We're running a surplus, thanks to very high energy prices, a very significant surplus in the current fiscal year. All of that gave us the ability as a government to support Albertans during a time of affordability challenge.
And speaking of elections, will you run in the next election, upcoming election?
Graham, I've been focused on preparing this budget and presenting it. I'm going to be finalizing a decision and announcing that in the days ahead.
But why wouldn't you know now? Sorry. Yeah, okay.
Audrey.
Hi, Audrey Neveu, Radio-Canada. I want to know, what are the consequences of the Alberta government if it ever happens that it does not respect the fiscal framework that it will set out in legislation? What's the consequence except just saying, oops, we broke our own law?
100 days of jail time. How's that?
You tell me.
Just kidding. Look, for a government to contravene its own legislation, and that's regardless of which government, legislation that was passed in the House would be far more than embarrassing. It would be a public spectacle. And there would be a huge political cost to bear for breaking that legislation. I believe that simply passing legislation around these fiscal rules provides real teeth in terms of the impetus for governments to follow them. That's why crafting the fiscal rules and the details in the fiscal rules are so important. We have a revenue structure here in the province and a resource-based economy where we have revenue volatility, and these rules have to accommodate that kind of revenue structure and economy, and I believe they do.
And my second question is, do the massive investments, well, big investments we see in the Alberta shares pave the way for an Alberta provincial police?
Right now, we're focused on better enforcement and less crime. That's the focus of our government. So we're making very significant investments, both in our public safety ministry as well as our justice ministry. And we're going to be funding well over 200 additional enforcement officers across the province. That's significant. That's our focus right now. And of course, the second part of that is to ensure that we have a justice system with the capacity to deal with, you know, every case that needs to be heard. Every perpetrator needs to have their day in court. Justice must be served. That's why we're increasing, again, public safety and justice ministry budgets by about 12% on average.
Great. Thank you, Audrey.
Hi, Minister. Julia Wong, CBC National. Considering how volatile things have been for Alberta in the last 10 years, could you have saved more? Could you have paid down the debt more, considering interest rates are so high?
We have, I mean, look, we inherited a government that was spending $10 billion more than comparator provinces back in 2019. We set out a fiscal plan to thoughtfully, carefully, surgically bring our cost of delivering government services down. We didn't take the Ralph Klein approach of doing it in 1 year with 20% cuts. We took 4 years to do it, which we believed would be easier on Albertans to take that route, and we've delivered on that. This year in 22-23, our per capita cost of delivering government services is right in line with the average of BC, Ontario, and Quebec, and so that's significant progress. That's what set the stage for this province to ultimately deliver balanced budgets into the future. So we immediately went to work on bringing fiscal responsibility back to the province, and it's that work that ultimately prepared us, led us to a very significant surplus last year, which allowed us to reduce our debt by over $13 billion, saving Albertans $260 million in 22-23, about $550 million in 23-24, and just under $600 million in 24-25 in debt service costs. That's almost $1.2 billion that can go to education, go to health care, or maybe go to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Again, you know, would it have been better that previous governments would have brought fiscal responsibility in the years earlier? Yes, it would have been. But the minute we took office in 2019, we went to work, and we had a few bumps. COVID, the largest contraction in the global economy since the Great Depression, and the largest collapse in energy prices in history was all in the mix. But again, we stuck to the plan, and I have to give credit to Albertans who dug in and worked hard and showed incredible resilience. Alberta entrepreneurs who saw opportunity that governments never could and stepped out and invested and grew this economy to where it's leading the nation right now. That's what dug us out of the hole. That's why we're able to pay down the debt and save Albertans these debt service costs.
You mentioned the Heritage Fund earlier. I want to ask you about the Alberta Fund because we all got a crash course on it a little bit earlier. Because what it sounds like is it's a way for the UCP government to say, hey, we have $1.4 billion left over right before the rates dropped and before there's an election.
The purpose of the Alberta Fund is to bring discipline to the use of a surplus. That's really the purpose of the Alberta Fund. Look, I know in our businesses or even in our households, in my experience, if you have unallocated surplus hanging around, it's pretty easy to spend it irresponsibly. The Alberta Fund will provide guardrails, will provide a framework, will require discipline in ultimately spending that money. There's only 3 uses for funds that end up in the Alberta Fund, which of course is all of the surplus that's not being used for debt repayment in the year that it's achieved. And of course, those uses are holding the funds for future debt repayment, additional deposits into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and of course, a one-time expenditures on strategic government priorities that are non-reoccurring. In other words, not just dumping it into programs and ultimately inflating the cost of delivering programs to an unsustainable level. The whole purpose of the Alberta Fund is in fact to bring discipline to the process.
Great, thank you. Catherine?
Catherine Gurkowski, Alberta Today. So the last few weeks and months I've been told, stay tuned, stay tuned, stay tuned. Stay tuned for the Liability Management Incentive Program details, for the CPP, for an Alberta Provincial Police, and there's a whole bunch of these promises. I'm not seeing details, I'm not seeing line items. Why are so many of these not accounted for in this budget?
Well, look, a budget is ultimately a strategic plan laid out numerically for the upcoming year. And so you're not seeing an Alberta pension plan in this budget. You're not seeing a definitive Alberta police force in this budget. And you're not seeing an R-Star program in this budget because none of those policies have been approved. Right now, we as a government are reaching out on all of them and consulting with Albertans. As the Minister of Finance, I'm looking forward to the day when I can release the report that we've been working on with respect to an Alberta pension plan. Right now, that report's being updated for a fresh data set that we received in December. The work will be done sometime in May, and it will be important that Albertans receive the report and can take a look at the opportunities and the risks of an Alberta pension plan and ultimately make the decision. So no, right now in this upcoming year, we don't have plans to move to an Alberta pension plan. And in terms of an Alberta police force, again, there's no budget line in there because we haven't made definitive plans to do that. All of these policies require engagement with Albertans, and ultimately Albertans need to decide.
And on healthcare, you had mentioned this 4.1% increase, but on your own self-imposed limitation of population plus inflation, you could have spent up to 8.7%. And we're even seeing cuts still in health to things like cancer research and prevention. Why not use that full amount that you could have? Why not go even bigger for health?
Our fiscal rules around a limitation on increasing expenditures no higher than population growth and CPI creates a ceiling. It doesn't create a target. Our target continues to be the fiscal anchor that we identified in 2020, and that is to align our per capita government spending with that of other provinces. We believe in Alberta we can deliver programs at least as efficiently as the other provinces. A 4% increase in health spending on top of a 4% increase the year before is very, very significant. And if we take the COVID costs out of the year before, out of 21-22, which were significant, we were right in the middle of COVID, then our increase in health spending is actually closer to 11%. We need to ensure that we're funding health adequately. We also need to ensure that we're continuing to bring fiscal discipline to the province. I believe this budget achieves both.
Hi, Lily Polenchuk from the Gateway. For my first question, for 3 years in a row, the Campus Alberta grant has received cuts, but with Budget 23, it seems like this trend is reversing. So if so, why have you decided to reverse this trend now?
So in Budget 2022, we as a province started to recognize that we have thousands of unfilled positions that require specific skills and competencies. We started reinvesting again in a significant way in our great world-class post-secondary institutions. That was really our workforce initiative. That was $600 million in total over 3 years. A portion of those funds were used to buy specific seats in specific occupations and disciplines where there was great demand. Just a really quick story. For the funds we set aside, we believed we could buy 7,000 seats, and these were seats in high demand areas. And Minister Nicolaides, to his credit, worked with our great post-secondary institutions. And ultimately, for that same amount of money, they're providing 10,000 additional learning seats. We're building on that. As you point out in Budget 2023, this is about, again, recognizing a great need for Alberta employers, but also a really important great need for Albertans to have the skills they need to participate in this great Alberta advantage. That's why we're investing, but we're doing it in a different way. Much of our investment is targeted towards the specific seats in the occupations and professions that are in great demand. An incredibly valuable and worthwhile investment.
Great, thank you. And for my second question, you earlier said that Budget 23 is a continuation of Budget 2019. And in Budget 23, you are changing the interest rates for student loans from the prime plus 1% rate to the prime rate. But in 2019, it was the opposite. It was changed from already being at the prime rate to prime plus the 1%. So what affected this change?
Sure. That's a great question, an astute question. In terms of delivering a budget and a fiscal plan that's fiscally responsible, that was the direction we set in 2019. Budget 2023 aligns with that overall principle. Here's the good news. We've spent 3 years doing the heavy lifting, making difficult decisions, all of us as Albertans. And we've got our fiscal house in order. We've achieved the fiscal anchor of aligning our per capita costs of delivering services with that of comparative provinces. That's a key anchor. And now that gives us the ability to move spending up, prioritize and fund key priorities of Albertans. And again, right now, we are really facing an affordability challenge that's been unprecedented in recent time. And this is a way that we can provide real tangible relief for Alberta students.
Great, thank you. We're just going to switch to the lines because we have quite a few people waiting right now. We'll come back to the room in a little bit. So operator, can you put through the first caller?
Thank you. I'm a Greenie, Globe and Mail.
Yeah, g'day, Minister. I want to ask you about the new Alberta Fund. Can you please expand on the reason why it is that your government is shifting what could be significant capital expenses, even if just one time, to a separate fund? I mean, you could have billions in targeted spending here, but you're choosing to omit that from budget. So can you say why?
Well, again, Emma, we're establishing the Alberta Fund to bring discipline to the use of our surpluses. I really believe it's critically important that Albertans get full value and have their surpluses managed in a publicly beneficial way. That's the purpose of the Alberta Fund. It's not, it's to be more transparent with Albertans on the use of those funds. As I've mentioned, when a surplus is achieved, effectively that surplus can be used for debt repayment, additional deposit into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, or for one-time, non-reoccurring strategic priorities of the government. And again, the Alberta Fund is so that we can be more transparent and bring more fiscal responsibility on behalf of Albertans. The budget process is the place where we identify priorities of Albertans and needs within government-delivered services such as healthcare and education. And it's in that budget process that we look to make thoughtful, durable and sustainable decisions, appropriate decisions around funding programming.
Emma, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you're saying that it's going to bring discipline, but in fact, you can spend this on anything you like that is a one-time spend. I mean, there's an election coming up, to Graham's point earlier. You could find anything in a riding where you need votes and polling is shown as being close. So explain to Albertans why this is not simply a pre-election slush fund.
Emma, well, I appreciate the question. It's anything but a slush fund. It was conceived to bring discipline to the use of surplus. And so surplus could only be used for three uses, with a priority being saving and debt repayment. Now, included in these fiscal rules is a balanced budget requirement. Included in the fiscal rules is, in fact, an expenditure ceiling, and including in the fiscal rules is a requirement that the government deliver based on the budget, with effectively only the contingency for use for emergencies, disasters, or unforeseen expenditures that may arise in the year. So again, the fiscal framework, the layering of protection, I believe will ensure that governments cannot act irresponsibly ahead of an election, per se, and spend a surplus that's sitting in the account. Look, even if the funds are in surplus, we're going to, running a significant surplus this year. Now we're paying down a lot of debt, which I believe is the best use for a surplus. But any surplus that sits in that Alberta fund has to be, to spend it, it has to be reflected in the budget. It can't just be, governments just can't go in there and take it and run off and spend it. It has to be spent in a consistent way with the budget that I'm going to look to present to the legislature and hopefully pass within the next 3 to 4 weeks. So again, there's a series of controls that will bring fiscal discipline to any government, and the Alberta Fund is just another mechanism to bring that discipline.
Operator, can you put through the next caller?
Thank you. Jeremy Thompson, CTV.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question here. Firstly, just wondering about the spending on major cities, Edmonton and Calgary. How much of an effort was made to make the spending, relatively equal? It looks like they're both getting about $2 billion. What can you say about the division between the two major cities?
Look, when ministries bring requests, whether it's operating requests or capital requests to Treasury Board, we at Treasury Board take a look at where's the greatest need and where's the greatest return on investment. What are the biggest priorities for Albertans, regardless of geography? That's the reality. The fact is that Calgary and Edmonton are both great big world-class cities, and so there's going to be significant capital funds spent in both of those regions and both of those municipalities, but also right across Alberta. We, again, make decisions based on need and priority and defensibility, and that was the way the decisions were taken this year.
Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and then just when it comes to cities, I'm sure, they might be interested in accessing some of the funds in that Alberta fund. it's over $1 billion. Is there a process for cities to sort of request access to that, perhaps for a new arena or upgrades to a stadium like Commonwealth?
Well, in terms of municipalities directly accessing the fund, the answer is no. There is no mechanism, and that's by design. Again, the Alberta Fund was established to bring discipline to the use of surplus. There's only 3 uses for those funds. The priority will be given to debt reduction, debt repayment, further investment in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and also an allowance for one-time spending that's non-reoccurring that aligns with strategic government priorities.
Operator, can you put through the next caller?
Janet French, CBC.
Hello there. Some of the structural costs that you've built into this budget rely on oil revenues to sustain. This seems to me to be completely opposite to the work that you've done to slim down the government during the last 3 years to rein in these structural costs. So what's your long-term plan to sustain these service levels without relying on resource revenues?
That's been an age-old question here in Alberta. Job number 1 was bringing responsible fiscal management to the bottom half of the income statement, to our expenditures, and that's what we believed was the first job, and we've worked hard at that over the last 4 years. Again, doing it thoughtfully, surgically, but getting it done, bringing our expenditures in line to where they're at a much more sustainable level going forward. They're to the point where we can make additional reinvestment. We can invest in Alberta's priorities. We can meet emerging needs because we've done the heavy fiscal lifting. Now, with respect to Alberta's revenue structure, it does remain volatile. We do depend at this point, certainly to a significant degree, on non-renewable resource revenues. And that's our reality right now. At the same time, we've focused on, again, creating a business environment that would attract investment and further diversify the economy. That's also happening, and that's in part reflected in the increasing corporate tax revenue and personal tax revenue that we see in the province. So that is also part of the equation, and we're focused on that. There's great value in a more diversified economy in Alberta, not only so that Albertans can have, find and pursue careers, perhaps that they couldn't in Alberta a few years ago, but it also will create more stability for government revenues going forward.
Did you have a follow-up?
I do, but if we're looking at the numbers for 23-24, I mean, $18 billion of the revenue you're expecting is coming from resource revenues, and we're going to spend $68 billion. What's to prevent you, if oil prices crash, from having to come back and then lay off all these healthcare workers, these education workers that you're hiring?
Look, we went through a period of time where WTI oil prices hit the negatives in 2020. And the WCS prices stayed at $10 for far too long. We managed through that, and we managed through that while we continued to deliver government services. In fact, at the time, we were dealing with a pandemic, and we were having to support Albertans at a much higher level because of that. I talk about the importance of paying down debt. Paying down debt creates fiscal room. And when you have fiscal room, you can more effectively deal with an economic shock that might be coming in the future. Ultimately, that's the whole goal of paying down debt, or certainly one of the goals. One of the other benefits, of course, is reduced debt servicing costs. I've said in previous years, and I continue to believe it, after the government of Alberta gets their spending in line, which we've achieved that, at some point in the future, it'll be important that Alberta takes a look at its revenue structure to ensure that it's most appropriate, that it's most efficient. There's a time when that will be important, and that time will probably be in the not too distant future. But right now, we're focused on delivering very efficiently. We're also focused on positioning Alberta's economy for economic growth and diversification, which also diversifies the government's revenues.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more on the line, then we'll come back to the room. So, operator, put in the next caller.
David Staples, Edmonton Journal.
Hi, thanks for taking my call, Minister. So I'm looking at the increase in non-renewable resource revenue from 2 years ago to now. 2 years ago, it was $3.1 billion. Now it's $27.5 billion. So that's a 790% increase in renewable resource revenue. someone looking at that might say, well, you're taking a lot of, why do you deserve credit for balancing the budget and paying down the debt when you get that kind of economic windfall? What would you say to someone who poses such a question to you? What credit do you think your government deserves here?
David, that's a great question. And energy revenues, non-renewable resource revenues, oil royalties, if you will, continue to play a big part in our revenue mix. And of course, the energy industry is a major industry in the province. And so it contributes to economic activity, which of course support personal income tax revenue and revenues from corporate taxes as well. So it's a major player in Alberta. But it's the combination of things. Granted, the recovery in energy prices was very, very significant. But David, if you recall, when we presented Budget 2022 a year ago, we presented that budget based on fairly modest energy prices that were realistic based on the time and the day. And we were projecting very modest surpluses. We were projecting a surplus last year of $500 million. And we also had done the work. We had extrapolated where our spending would be had we continued on the spending trajectory of the previous government. And instead of a $500 million surplus, we would have had a $6 billion deficit. So a balanced budget is a combination of things. Firstly, we absolutely have been blessed as Albertans over the last year and a half with an increase in recovery in energy prices, certainly a big part of the story. At the same time, we've seen government revenues grow broadly as we've seen a more diversified economy, contributing to more personal income tax revenue and corporate tax revenue for the province of Alberta. And at the same time, our fiscal discipline, bringing our spending in line with other provinces, bringing our spending to sustainable levels has been a big part of the story. It's really been all three.
David, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, if that same person then, same voter asked you, well, if the NDP was in power right now and enjoyed this same kind of massive windfall in resource revenue, wouldn't they also have a big surplus and also have paid down the debt significantly? And if not, why wouldn't they have done it?
Well, David, again, based on the spending trajectory of the NDP when they were in office from 2015 to 2019, increasing spending by 4% a year when our economy was flatlined and revenues were declining, had they been in office the last 4 years, again, given the revenue assumptions that we made at budget time, again, they would have been reporting a $6 billion deficit, not a $500 million surplus. And the fact that we're now projecting a $10 billion surplus for the current year that we're in, I think we could also extrapolate, holding all things constant. It wouldn't have been 10, it would have been more like 4 had the NDP been in office and had they continued to spend on the same trajectory. Fiscal discipline matters, David, and it's a big and key ingredient in presenting a budget that's ultimately balanced through all 3 years of the fiscal plan.
Awesome. Operator, can you put through the next caller?
Thank you. Josh Aldridge, Calgary Herald.
Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you for taking my question. You've talked a lot about what's happened since 2019 when the UCP came into power, about the impacts on the economy and the investments that are made there. But going through the budget this year, there's not a lot that really stands out that's new in terms of that investment in the business sector. Are you looking at this as more of just kind of stability to further invigorate that sector, or are there specific programs or specific things that are in this budget that you're looking at to provide more of an injection into that business community? Because looking at it right now, not a lot there.
That's a great question, and I'd love to answer that. Because again, back in 2019, we worked hard to create a very competitive business environment broadly. That's why we brought down our corporate tax rate, our general tax rate, from 12 to 8%. That's why we've been focused on red tape reduction, regulatory modernization across sectors. And we've done that because we believe it's important that broadly we should have a very competitive business environment, because there'll be opportunities that government could never see. And if we have a very broad-based competitive business environment, entrepreneurs and investors can take advantage of opportunities regardless of what sector. And that's what we're seeing today. And that's been very, very gratifying. And it's resulted in a diversifying economy of significant proportion.
Awesome. Josh, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Was there any real consideration into further lowering the corporate business or the corporate tax or the small business tax to further address some of the inflationary pressures, especially with the global slowdown coming?
You know, we consider our tax structure as we look at every budget. Right now, we are very, very competitive, more than competitive from a Canadian standpoint, and very competitive with U.S. states. So we believe that we've calibrated our corporate tax rate at the right level. I should also mention that we have done some very specific, unique things in this budget with respect to our business environment. We have brought in the agri-food processing and manufacturing tax credit, non-refundable corporate tax credit, which again will further improve the competitiveness of our agri-food processing and manufacturing sector and our agriculture industry broadly. We've increased the film tax credit going forward, which again will improve our competitiveness in that space. And we've seen the film and television industry absolutely explode over the last few years. So two things. Budget 23 is about stability, and business investment craves stability. I know as a business owner and manager, stability and certainty are critical. That's what Budget 23 does. It brings stability. At the same time, we're making tweaks to even further improve the competitiveness of our business environment.
Awesome. We'll take it back to the room.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's Lisa Johnson from the Edmonton Journal. Hi, Minister. I just want to go back to Emma's question about the Alberta Fund. You're saying that the purpose of the fund is to have guardrails up to direct how the government spends a surplus or what it does with a surplus. But this is discretionary one-time funding. Are you promising that you are going to detail any spending from the Alberta Fund, if there is any, before the election in the legislature? Because there are no details in this document, in the documents today, about what the government plans to spend potentially $1.4 billion on, potentially a month before the writ is dropped.
Any spending that's done between now and the election needs to be reflected in the appropriations bill and fiscal plan that I'm presenting in the legislature later today. That's a reality for the upcoming budget year. Again, there's a contingency amount, $1.5 billion in the budget that I'm presenting. And that contingency fund is crucially, vitally important to ensure that we can deal with disasters and emergencies that we're unable to budget or plan for. But again, any plans and programs need to be reflected in this appropriations bill. And so, no, again, the Alberta Fund really does provide guardrails. And firstly, at least 50% of a surplus has to be used towards debt that's maturing in the year the surplus is attained. That's number one. It prioritizes debt repayment. That's our fiscal rule. But anything that ends up in the Alberta Fund, only debt repayment, additional investment into the Heritage Trust Fund, or again, one-time non-reoccurring investments that align with government strategic priorities could fit as well. But that needs to be reflected. Those plans need to be reflected in a budget.
Follow up?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, but we won't see a fiscal update until after the election, so we won't have those details. But you're saying that it's going to be reflected in appropriations in detail. Just to clarify, but I have a second question, which is a bit of a niche question. In a mandate letter to her minister, Premier Danielle Smith asked for a digital innovation tax credit for video game creators. I'm wondering why that was abandoned in this budget. I don't see it anywhere in the budget.
Sure. I mean, you know what? We constantly evaluate our competitiveness in every sector where we know we're naturally competitive. Certainly the tech sector is an area where we're naturally competitive. The numbers speak for themselves. And I should point out that in 2022, Alberta set another record in terms of venture capital investment at something like $729 million. And we did that. We set a new record at a time when provinces, other large provinces with large tech sectors, saw a decline in investment. So the point there is that Alberta is very competitive in the tech space. We have a growing tech sector in Alberta. We evaluate the competitiveness of every sector ahead of every budget, and a digital media tax credit is not included in this budget. We continue to work with the sector and the industry to understand what they're going to need to remain competitive. If I take a look broadly at the tech sector, what we're doing, again, broadly as a province, and that includes governments, includes our academic institutions, it includes our world-class tech sector, what we're doing broadly is working because we're winning with venture capital investment.
Great. Thanks, Lisa.
Good afternoon. It's Safe Kaiser, Global News. Minister, a couple questions back a couple of times. You said this is not an election budget, but when we actually look at the budget, we see Calgary, which is a battleground, mentioned almost double the amount of times Edmonton is, more money going to Calgary for more things. Why would that be the case if you're claiming this isn't an election budget?
Again, I can tell you, as the President of Treasury Board, our practice when we consider requests from ministries, whether they be operating, but especially capital. As you can imagine, every ministry lobbies hard for capital. And of course, we hear interventions from every MLA, rightfully so, as they're working to do their job. At Treasury Board, we have a comprehensive rating process that rates capital projects based on the need, based on the priority, based on the return of investment to Albertans, based on the readiness of that project. And it's through that checklist that ultimately informs our decisions at Treasury Board as to which projects we approve and move forward with. And so, from time to time, some years it's going to be rural Alberta. Other times it might be the north. I can't wait for that day, being from Grand Prairie. Other times it'll be the south or Calgary or Edmonton. But again, as the President of Treasury Board, we take a disciplined view, and we want to ensure, and we work to ensure, that the highest priority, the most defensible projects are the ones that are funded. Budget 23 is no exception.
Right. So what you're saying then is all of the requests you've received from Edmonton. I mean, Edmonton has just as big of a population and as many problems as Calgary does. You're saying the requests you've seen don't give you a large enough return of investment that you think it's worthwhile investing into those problems in Edmonton.
Well, the projects are ranked based on need and priority. They have a ranking based on safety. They certainly have a ranking based on readiness. All of those factors are considered when Treasury Board makes the final decisions around the capital plan. And I can tell you this, that again, from time to time, it'll be Calgary, Edmonton, or rural Alberta that seems to, get a disproportionate amount of that investment. But that's the process we stick to, and that's the process we undertook in Budget 23.
Thanks, Eve.
Hi, Minister. Morgan Black, also with Global News. On the topic of priorities, I know affordable housing has been a big priority for Edmonton for a number of years. I didn't see that explicitly in the budget. I don't know if that's included in MSI funding, but why was that not encompassed within this budget?
That's a great question. We are funding affordable housing in Budget 23. We're increasing funding for affordable housing. And it will be a key part of Budget 23. There's a great need out there, both in our municipalities, Edmonton and Calgary especially, but more than that. We can go to Grand Prairie, Fort McMurray, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, other regions as well. And we have a long-term strategy around affordable housing. Our goal is to add 25,000 additional doors over time. We're sticking with that plan. Budget 23 ultimately delivers on the long-term plan to add more affordable housing options for Albertans.
Do you think? All right. And my colleagues asked such great questions that I just thought this one, if you had any more surplus, what would you have invested it in that's not encompassed in this budget, and why?
That's a great question. If with additional surplus, I believe that we should really be making debt repayment a priority in the future. Over the last few years, of course, with the shock of COVID, I talked about, it's kind of the triple black swan event, huge crash in energy prices, contraction in the global economy. Alberta's debt grew. That's the reality. We had to deliver for Albertans during that time. And there was a time in March, April of 2020 when there was great global uncertainty economically, and all subnational governments in Canada, none of us could borrow, none of us could float a bond issue. And that lasted for quite a long period of time. And it was at that time I recognized the great need to create fiscal room so that a province like Alberta can handle an economic or fiscal shock in the future. That's why debt repayment, I believe, should be a great priority, because as you pay down debt, you create fiscal room so that you can handle a shock in the future. The good news is this. We set a fiscal anchor of keeping our net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, keeping a relatively strong balance sheet even during those dark days. By the end of this year, that net debt to GDP ratio is 10%, the strongest balance sheet of any province in the country by far. That's good news for all of Albertans.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions from the line, and then we have a hard stop at 1:45. So, operator, can you put through the next caller?
One moment, please. Thank you. The next question is from Chris Varco, Calgary Herald.
Minister, what will be the split for how your government treats future surpluses from the Alberta Fund? In other words, how will you decide how to divvy that up between the 3 different buckets that you've already laid out today?
Chris, that's a great question. And we've allowed flexibility in the use of the Alberta Fund. Again, flexibility for debt repayment, further investment in the Heritage Trust Fund, or perhaps one-time strategic projects. And, my mind goes probably, if it is going to be used for those purposes, those are probably capital projects. But I believe that we need to leave flexibility, because for governments of the day, they're going to need to evaluate the cost of capital, cost of borrowing. They're going to need to evaluate expected returns in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. They're going to need to take a look at their overall debt levels. All of those features, I believe, should inform decisions around ultimate surplus allocation. Again, Chris, if you heard my answer to the previous question, you know my preference. My preference right now is debt repayment, debt reduction, in order to create fiscal room, because fiscal room gives a province such as Alberta more optionality, more flexibility should we hit another economic shock in the future. And at the same time, right now, our cost of capital, like every government around the world, has been creeping up with interest rates, even though our cost of capital relative to Ontario was going down because of our strong balance sheet. The reality is we're in a time of increasing interest rates. And so right now, debt repayment also materially lowers debt service costs, which that funding can be available for programming or future investment in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund.
Chris, did you have a quick follow-up?
Yes, this is a bit of a 2-part question, Minister, but is it your target to drive net debt down to zero? And just going back to your earlier comments about the effectiveness of balanced budget bills, given the fact that we've already seen them in the past in this province in the 1990s and in the 2000s, and they were subsequently ignored by future governments, how successful or how effective are they?
Chris, I believe a well-thought-out set of fiscal rules, a well-thought-out fiscal framework, like the framework that I'll be ultimately presenting in the House in the form of proposed legislation. I believe that type of fiscal framework can be very durable. But there needs to be enough flexibility in the framework so that it can account and adjust for a very volatile revenue structure, which we have in this province. And I believe these fiscal rules will accommodate that. And at the same time, bringing real fiscal rigor to financial decisions by a future government. So again, as you know, we have a balanced budget requirement, or we'll be proposing legislation that will require a balanced budget. But there are exceptions with material drops in revenue that we have to have in this province, or the fiscal rule simply won't work, and it will need to be repealed. When it comes to our fiscal rules around limiting expenditure increases to population growth and inflation, again, we're building on the previous year's expense ceiling, not the previous year's actual results. That's significant. that will ensure that wise governments start to create a little bit of unused room so that they can deal with a shock that would inevitably come. I believe these fiscal rules will deliver well for Albertans for years, hopefully decades to come, and will help ensure sound, fiscal decision making.
Great, thank you. That is all the time we have for today. We're going to end it there. For those on the line we didn't get to, apologize. You can always follow up with myself. My contact information is on the news releases. Thanks.
All right, I think I've got the thumbs up all around. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here today with Minister of Health.